Hello, welcome to another Parallel Project Training podcast. This podcast is based on the APM PMQ syllabus for exams starting in September 2024. My name's Ruth Phillips and I'm joined by Lisa Regan, who's one of Parallel's senior trainers. Today we're going to be talking about conflict resolution. Welcome to the podcast, Lisa.
Hi Ruth. Happy to be talking, not in conflict, but talking about conflict.
That's right. Yes, hopefully there won't be too much conflict between us when we talk about this. What we've been doing in the podcast is going to the syllabus and looking at the learning objectives and outcomes for each of the topics. Let's have a look at what APM wants us to be able to demonstrate that we know about in terms of conflict resolution. The learning objective is to understand conflict resolution as the ability to identify and address differences between individuals and or interest groups. That's a pretty nice definition of what conflict actually is.
For me, as an ex-project manager, conflict is part of the way of working, isn't it? It's got to be, because we're dealing with people. People are people, as they say. If you ask a project manager, can you give me some examples of conflict on your project? Every single one of them will have a list. I'm really glad that it's in the syllabus for the PMQ because it's really important and it's a real skill to be able to have conflict resolution on projects.
I couldn't agree with you more. Often, it's not something that does appear on the syllabus of project management courses because it's seen very much as a people aspect of things rather than a process or tools and techniques. But as you said, it's fundamental to manage conflict within a project because it's not something that you're going to be able to ignore.
Yeah, absolutely.
The whole project environment has bigger picture conflicts. I was thinking about this before we started recording, and we often talk about the tension between projects and business as usual.
Right.
That can actually contribute to conflict on a much bigger scale. It's not necessarily about an individual against another individual within a project, but actually the whole project environment and its need to deliver change conflicting with the repeatability, the process-driven business as usual environment. That's quite interesting as well.
Yeah, absolutely.
Let's have a look at these learning outcomes then. So the first one is that we've got to know the sources of conflict within a project. So what would you say are the major sources of conflict within a project?
What I'd like to do, if it's okay, Ruth, it helps me to think about each different stage of the project life cycle. If we start from concept, day one, what are the kinds of conflict that come up within concept? For me, it's about the funding. In the concept phase, you're asking the organisation to give you the funding. So the people that will be in conflict, usually it's the sponsor and the organisation. The project would like this amount of money, but the organisation can only prioritise that amount, for example. So,
and possibly conflict between projects competing for the same funding as well. Yes. There's both within the project and a bit outside of the project. That's concept. What about the next stage?
Moving on to definition. Now it's more about the project manager because the project manager steps forward in definition, is involved with all the planning. So examples are things like the resource plan. It's got to be controversial. I'd like this resource. And again, talking about competing between other projects, you might need this resource for a certain amount of time. Somebody else has already been allocated. So the resource plan for me, and even as fundamental as what's in scope. When you're doing your planning, that could be a hot topic, couldn't it?
Absolutely.
That kind of, is it in scope or not?
Linked to that, the quality aspects of agreeing what does good look like on the project. There can be a lot of conflict between the project manager, suppliers, users.
Absolutely. It's not as simple as just saying, this is my plan, off you go. That's definition. I'll move on to talk about deployment. So deployment, this is where the work is happening. Deadlines, a conflict out there. It's a real hot topic. You've asked people in the team to deliver by a certain date and something happens, things get in the way and they're not performing to the deadline that you'd like them to. So you've got to, as a project manager, either renegotiate, replan, whatever you've got to do to make it right. What else in deployment? It could be as simple as people just not following the process. In deployment, you'd come into conflict because, again, taking it back to quality, then they wouldn't be delivering the level of quality that you'd need them to.
It's interesting, as we've moved through those stages, who the conflict between is changing. We started off where it was high level, sponsor level, and the conflict with the sponsor, but now within the team, the users, that kind of conflict.
Yeah, absolutely. When we get into transition, when we've done all the delivery, it could be things about those acceptance criteria. When the users are saying, actually, that's not what I wanted, or actually, you haven't delivered time, cost and quality that I was looking for, they might not accept what you're delivering. So conflict's going to happen then.
Absolutely.
So it's moving from the project manager and the team in deployment to the project manager and the users in transition.
Yeah, that is where a lot of conflict arises, because we've gone to our best efforts within definition to really pin down quality criteria and to really to understand the requirements. But all too often, then something's delivered and the user, oh, that's not what I meant.
Yeah.
That can create a lot of conflict, can't it?
Yeah, absolutely. And that takes me really nicely into adoption, actually, Ruth, because the people in BAU don't always accept what you've delivered. We're not talking about transition when they're accepting what it is. It's when they've actually got to use it. Yeah. I heard that many times on projects. You said it was going to do this and it doesn't. You said and it doesn't. Sometimes the people in BAU don't accept the outputs of the project.
And that's so important, because if they don't accept that, and if there is conflict in that stage, then we're very unlikely to be able to deliver all of the benefits of the project, which is fundamental.
Absolutely. Again, you've segued me very nicely into benefits that I also wanted to finish up on. So in the benefits realisation phase, how are we going to measure those benefits? And actually, what I should have said was who's involved. It's the sponsor that's involved here. We've gone full circle, haven't we, from in the concept phase, it was the sponsor and the organisation. In the benefits realisation phase, it's the sponsor and the team again, isn't it? So how are we going to measure those benefits? Who's going to measure them? When are you going to report them back in? When is good enough good enough?
Particularly when we've got a project life cycle that isn't extended to cover that benefits realisation phase, there's a lot of conflict there, because it's not now the project environment that's looking at benefit realisation. We're looking at other people to do that, their expectations, how they measure it, whether they agree with that. All of that can cause problems and conflicts. Yeah. A lot of sources of conflict within the project. I'm beginning to understand your point that we can't do a project without conflict. The second learning outcome is that we've got to understand that conflict present in all of those stages, as we've talked about, can have both positive and negative impacts within a project. When we talked about those sources of conflict, we were erring a little bit towards them being negative impact. Tell me about positive conflict.
Well, positive conflict for me gives you that opportunity to have a debate with people. And I don't know about you, Ruth, I love having a discussion. Hearing other people's opinions, hearing other people's thoughts on things and stacking it up and going, okay, maybe we should be doing it this way. Conflict gives you that opportunity to open the field. It's not always negative and you can't ignore it. That's the thing to think about conflict. It's not the kind of thing that you can sweep under the carpet, because it's not going away. And people don't forget.
I worked on a project which had a really nice term for positive conflict. We used to call it creative tension.
Oh, nice. Yeah.
Nice.
Nice.
Essentially, it was positive, it was constructive, but it was allowing people to disagree. It was allowing people to get those differences of opinion out on the table and talk about them with the aim of delivering a better solution.
Absolutely.
Of being creative, of generating innovative solutions. That was a really good example of it.
Fundamentally, it can guide you in a different direction that you weren't expecting, and not a bad way, in a more positive way.
Definitely. Okay, so we know that we're going to have conflict. It could be positive, it could be negative. The final learning objective then is to know the ways in which conflict can be addressed in different situations. And the syllabus specifically asks us to look at the Thomas Kilmann conflict mode instrument, which is very catchy.
Okay. It's why use 5 words when one will do?
Absolutely. Can we have an acronym for that?
Somebody will come up with one for sure. The Thomas Kilmann conflict mode instrument. It's got 5 categories within it. Okay. It's a 2x2 grid to start with something in the middle, if that gives you a picture in your mind. So the scale of the grid, it goes from desire to satisfy your own needs on one scale, and on the other scale, it's desire to satisfy other people's needs. Okay. The way I think about it is being selfish versus being selfless. Okay. There's 2, high and low, high selfish, low selfish, high selfless, low selfish.
Yeah. And then there's something in the middle as well.
And something in the middle. Yeah. So we'll talk through each one in turn. When I talk about Thomas Kilmann, I always like to start with compete, because for me it's the extreme. Even though it's high on the personal, so high on the selfish, low on the selfless, I can see that as being the extreme way of dealing with conflict. So competing for me, it's when somebody bashes the fist on the desk and says, my way or the highway. Okay, we've got a conflict, but I'm telling you, this is how we're going to resolve it.
Yeah. What situation would that be a good time to use the compete mode?
It's a bit counterintuitive. And when I've talked to people about this before, they say, oh, I'd never do that. But sometimes you have to. Things like when things are health and safety critical. Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
If you're having to comply to any kind of legal or regulatory stipulation, if you need a quick answer, you've got to be decisive and say, this is how we're going to do it. Does that make sense? That's
absolutely does. And I can see that now. If you've got your project sponsor who is maybe legally responsible for certain things, I could understand why they would, as you said, put the fist down and say, no, this is what's happening. Okay.
So that's compete. I always like to start with that because it feels like the extreme for me. So opposite to that in the grid is accommodate. So you're being low on the selfish and then high on other people. So accommodate, it's basically being a yes person, if that makes sense. You're saying, okay, I'm looking at the long game here. We're in conflict, but it doesn't mean as much to me as it does to you, if that makes sense. So it's not so critical. We'll do it your way for now, but with the understanding that in future, we might have to have a bit more debate on this subject, It's not 100% closed. It's, okay, for now, we'll go your way and 100% your way, but at some point, we might have to talk about it. Another way that it might be good to do accommodate is when you've got someone that's learning the job. You'll say, okay, if that's what you think we should do, let's do that and see. Let somebody make the decision, and if it doesn't work out, support them to fix it.
Absolutely. And learn from that.
Absolutely.
And another situation might be when maybe somebody's come up with one of those absolutely genius ideas and that is completely different from what you were thinking, but actually you think, wow, let's go with that.
Absolutely. So accommodate there is the opposite of a bashing a fist on the desk.
We've got compete, very selfish, and accommodate, very selfless. What are some of the others then?
The other two are halfway between. Avoid is the one where you're being low on both scales. You're being low on the selfish, low on the selfless scale. Basically, you put your head in the sand with avoid. You're not giving in to the other person. You're just saying, I'm not even going to talk about it. Not even going to discuss it.
We said conflict resolution, it's really important because you can't avoid conflict on projects. Are there any situations where avoid is the right way to proceed?
If the situation's getting really heated, there is just no point trying to go that extra mile when people's emotions are not in the room, they're somewhere else. So sometimes it is good to, what's that phrase, take it offline. Take it offline and say, we won't do that now. We won't even have a discussion about it, but go away, do your research. We'll come back this time tomorrow.
So it could be a temporary avoidance. Maybe it's kind of get the right vibes going.
That's it.
Making sure that people are in a better headspace to be able to talk about things. But for the moment, say, no, we're not.
That's it. I think of it as kind of kicking the can down the road, if that makes sense. There will be a debate. It just won't be right now.
So we've done compete, accommodate, avoid. What's the last one in the grid?
So the last one in the grid, and again, I like to do it as last before we get to the middle, is collaborate. So the long-term goal is to collaborate. You're thinking of other people, but you're also thinking of yourself.
Okay.
And
so
I think
the win-win.
This is the win-win. So it's the long-term goal in any kind of negotiation or conflict. It's the long-term goal. However, it takes time and effort to get to this collaborative way of working. It's not an overnight solution. It's not something you can flick a switch and say, we've done it, we've agreed. It takes time and it takes trust and it takes openness.
I was just about to say to you, I bet that takes a lot of trust there, and trust that actually by working together, you're going to get the right solution.
Yeah, absolutely. So we've gone around the 4 quadrants of the Thomas Kilmann. The one in the middle is compromise. We would all like to collaborate, but in the real world, we usually end up compromising. If time is a pressure, you could come to a compromise. You mentioned, Ruth, about collaborate being win-win. Compromise is kind of half win, half lose, if that makes sense. Nobody is fully satisfied or fully happy, but nobody is completely unhappy with the situation. Compromise, you give a bit, they give a bit, but you're always going to look for collaboration in the long term. Compromise is this is what we'll do for now, but in the long term, we would hope to be able to collaborate, if that makes sense. Yeah.
So do you think compromise is at use in the earlier stages of the project where we quite haven't got that trust?
Yes.
To be able to take us into collaborate?
Yep, I would think so, to make some kind of progress as opposed to head in the sand, nothing's going to happen. Some kind of progress with a view to collaborating in future, absolutely.
Yeah. That's been really useful for me, that sometimes you can be reactive, like gut feeling reactive to conflict and without necessarily thinking what the best strategy to deal with it is. But that gives you a really nice model to use to help you think through what's the best strategy in this situation.
Absolutely, because I think people have their own default, don't they, over time, and it's not always the right wrong for the situation, like you said, Ruth.
Fantastic. Well, I think we managed to discuss conflict resolution with remarkably little conflict, so that's been really useful. Thank you very much, Lisa.
Thanks, Ruth.